I am going to just introduce the session. There's no formal discussant role in this. So because I'm hosting this Zoom, I will just welcome everyone and say that we have Jason Allen, who will be presenting first, and I will let these folks introduce themselves. And then Dean Vesperman and Mariah will be presenting second. And the structure for this session is that each presenter gets about 20 minutes, and then we'll have time for some Q&A at the end. Of course, you can put those questions in the chat box if you would like to do that. And my guess is that we'll be able to replicate the SSEC feel and just ask questions of each other if we feel comfortable doing that too. So welcome to everyone. I'm really glad that you're here. And I'm just gonna turn it over to Jason.
Well, hello everyone. I'll share my screen here in a minute, but just to give you a quick background, I'm Jason Allen. I'm actually the social studies coordinator at Shepherd University. It's a very small university outside of Harpers Ferry, as we were saying, in the corner of West Virginia, about an hour-ish from Washington, D.C. So with that being said, I'm just going to go ahead and jump right in. And hopefully you can see my PowerPoint. What I am going to do, hopefully it starts for me. Sorry, I have the spinny wheel of death, it looks like. Oh, there it went, I think it went. All right, there we go. What I am going to be speaking on is when I was a social studies teacher, I'm 2 years in, everyone was kind of talking a little bit about tenure. I'm of course on tenure track, and I'm only 2 years removed from the field. I was a middle school social studies teacher for 17 years. And one thing that I had to teach, I actually taught 6th, 7th, and 8th, all 3 grades. Sometimes it would vary in and out. But I had a classroom decoration that was actually from Teacher Discovery called the Periodic Chart of Dictators, Despots, and Despised. And after seeing the theme for the conference, I thought I would maybe present a lesson that I did with this. I will be the first to say the lesson it evolved over time. It was still in flux as I got to it. So when we do Q&A, if anyone has any ideas how to mold it or anything like that, please chime in. But I'll go ahead and give a little bit of background on how I got into this lesson and then the lesson procedures themselves. Whoops, maybe. There it went. Just to give you a quick background, like I said, this was geared for 6th to 8th graders. Honestly, though, most of the time it was 6th grade. The reason why it was 6th grade, I don't know everyone's background as far as teaching, but 6th grade seems to be a jumping off point. Of course, you're going to start to getting into more difficult topics, heavier things in social studies. And I really wanted my 6th graders to be able to talk like a historian, think like a social scientist, things of that nature. But it was always sometimes a little tricky to find that hook to kind of get them to think a little more in depth. And I had this decoration in my room, and I have a little better image here on another slide, but it was called the Periodic Chart of Dictators, Despots, and Despised. And it was just really supposed to be an eye catcher, but I started to notice every year students were looking at it and studying it in homeroom when they would walk into class. So I started to think a little more about an activity that we could do with it. It was really, this activity that I'm going to talk about was really a starting point. Again, there was like a lot of strong interest. And I thought I wanted to make sure, well, I wanted to make sure that I addressed, social studies skills such as critical thinking. We would do things connected to it, such as point of view, rankings, and such. Also, I don't know, again, everyone's field as far as what you do, if you do anything with education, but I really focused on academic language. And if you have any students who do something called the EdTPA, actually, I think this might have been a good EdTPA project. Because we used a lot of academic language such as fascism, dictatorships, and authoritarianism and things of that nature. Also, I should say that it is actually weirdly rooted in Harry Truman, and I know this sounds a little weird, but in West Virginia, they've actually removed this standard now. There was an old standard that talked about debating the atomic bomb, and Harry Truman is actually listed on this chart. And a lot of students were curious as to why, and the beginnings of the lesson were actually molded from that. So, and I'll get into that in a little more detail later. Again, also, Another thing that I noticed was I had the chart up in my room for a few years before I really incorporated it. And then towards the end, I always kept it up. It started to get a little beat up towards the end, but around 2016, 2019, I noticed students were starting to use a lot of terms such as fascism, dictatorship, authoritarian, that they were hearing on the news. We were seeing a lot more in our current events units and junior scholastic, if anyone watches CNN 10 up front. And I started to think, students were throwing around these terms and I wasn't for sure if they had a strong understanding of it. So again, I kind of went back and was thinking, how can I incorporate this chart and make it connect or maybe help students understand exactly what fascism is? If a student would call someone a fascist in the class, did they actually understand what a fascist was or maybe some of the horrible events that were connected to it? So again, had that roots in current events. Hopefully that's a little better shot of what the chart is. As you can see, just to kind of give you an understanding of how to read it, it has all of these horrible people and Napoleon the pig from Animal Farm, which students always ask why he was on there or why a pig was, but that's besides the point. And it actually ranks them and gives them skulls on how horrible they were. Now, I'm going to talk about this in the next slide, but I did try to relate to the students that all of these are arbitrary numbers and someone else's opinion, which I think is actually an important 6th grade skill at the time to understand that we all have different opinions. So, but by and large, I told them, I said, they're on here for a reason, but some of them, are very debatable. And again, just to kind of get on that theme and maybe you can see them a little better with these screenshots. I started to get questions. Why is Truman on here? Why is Columbus on here? I had another chart called the Loved and Admired, and they would wonder why was someone like Peter the Great or Yasser Arafat actually was on both. Why is he on this poster and also on the Loved and Admired? Why do they have this many skulls? These were all things. So I thought, you know what? There is a hook here. There's some interest. Why don't we do something with it? But before I get into the lesson itself, a few things to note. I only used the chart as a tool. There was a lot of discussion, connection. Of course, we got into balloons and stuff from a lesson planning standpoint. But I did explain to the students before we even did the assignment, there's a lot of controversial topics on here. We're dealing with things such as genocide, terrorism. These are heavy topics. And I thought it was a good way to get students interested in these heavy topics, but I also wanted them to understand, this isn't a thing to joke about. It's a thing to debate. It's something to think about. Again, if we're going to use this and incorporate this, it needs to be taken seriously, which I have to say, I did this for about 5 or 6 years. I was always very happy with how they approached it. And again, I always told them, don't forget that no matter who's on this chart, no matter what your opinion ends up being, there was people's lives who were influenced by decisions. That's what history, social studies is all about. And again, I stress the serious nature of it. And again, it just went back to trying to deal or make a hook with something jumping from elementary to more secondary type thought process. Standards were all basically connected to West Virginia state standards when I did this. Also, if you're familiar with the National Council of Social Studies standards, I thought it mainly connected to theme number 2 and number 6, but I think you could pull some things out of it from the other aspects. Also, if we have time at the end, I'll show you this. When my students were doing the research portion of the procedures, I used something called hippoing their sources, which is looking at the historical context, the intended audience, the purpose, point of view, and outside information. I have worksheets and all, and they would write them down, just jot notes. So, and again, if we have a little more time, I'll show you that. I didn't want to make this a presentation on the hippo process. And again, that was something I had hanging up in my room. The guiding questions for the lesson itself were, I wanted students to think about what makes a person a dictator, a despot, or just simply despise, what makes a government authoritarian, how do economic, social, and political events lead to authoritarian governments? Is a fascist, a dictator, or an absolute monarch the same thing? That sometimes would get a little confusing. And are fascist rulers a 20th century trend, or can they exist today? And I will not lie, that was something that kind of came up a little bit later as I was doing this, especially in the 2016 through 2020 time period, because you would hear it so much in the news and said or asked. I did different things to circle back to these questions to make sure we were addressing with students. I've done things where they answered Google Docs. Sometimes we would just do a simple Q&A. I don't know if I ever fine-tuned perfectly how we sometimes circled back. I was always experimenting with different things, but we did come back to them different ways, different years. Vocabulary, I won't run down the list. You can see them there, but they were basically standard things I think you would associate with something called the periodic chart of dictators. As you can see, I did usually make the students do Harry Truman just because he was the president, at least initially, who was associated with this, with the standards. And also Mussolini was someone I wanted the students to be familiar with just because of the fascism connection. Assessments, I'll come back and mention how they're incorporated in the lesson, but just to kind of throw out the formative and the summative. As far as when their students were doing research, I did have a checklist, and I would do monitoring and have brief conferences with any type of questions. I did use Nearpod towards the end for some background information in a video and a warm-up. And I did 3, 2, 1 exit tickets after each day's presentation to kind of gauge for understanding. The summative was the presentation itself, making sure that the guiding questions were answered. And beforehand, I wanted to make sure the students had an understanding of the terms themselves. So we would usually do some sort of vocabulary assessment or quiz. The rubrics were always in a flux. I usually did some sort of general style rubric. And again, I would say I changed it every year. The main things that I was looking for were the students using the vocabulary associated with the chart. Again, using those governmental terms. Was the mechanics on the presentation well? I wanted them, since these were mostly 6th graders that were doing this, occasionally I would do it with 7th graders on a different topic, but I just wanted them to be comfortable using the materials, creating professional type documents, presentations, organizing it, and just understanding the subject matter. I didn't want to come out with a hammer and just destroy everything that did it. And if there was something that I thought was off fact-wise, we would usually address it in the Q&A. If it wasn't something so far off, it wasn't anything they got deducted for. But again, it was more of just getting them used to talking about heavy topics. And that's a sample rubric that I used one year. There's other ones that I did. And like I say, I was always tweaking it year in and year out. The procedures themselves, I did a Nearpod warm-up. Usually it was 5 questions after they watched the short YouTube video. I would sometimes alter the video depending on if I found something better, but it was just something to give them an understanding on some of these extreme terms. Students sometimes, and honestly, I think adults and even myself, dictator, fascist, authoritarian, totalitarian, they're all terms that kind of mingle in some aspects. So trying to understand the differences in them was something that I tried to get students to understand. It sometimes still was confusing at the end, but I always thought they came out of it with a better understanding than they did coming in. Once the presentation started, I would always take a minute or two the first day or first portion of class to address any exit ticket questions. The research, I allowed students to do it in groups or as an individual. Within the research itself, students had to, 1, have a brief bio of the person they were researching. They had to have an explanation as to why the person is on the chart. They had to address the number of skulls, and they had to take a position whether they thought that was the proper amount based on the research. I mentioned some years I would actually incorporate Truman and they do a little comparison. Towards the end, I actually scratched that because I thought it was taking away from some aspects of what I wanted them to get out of it. And I can during the Q&A, if anyone's curious, I can expand on that. The presentation rules, these were my main ones. 1, I wanted the students to do bullets. And again, this is probably the teacher in me a little bit, but I don't know if anyone's seen a middle schooler do a PowerPoint. Sometimes they like to put paragraphs. So I wanted them to hit the information and be able to show it. Imagery, I did not want the students to go crazy with any harsh imagery related to any of these individuals, or it had to be approved by me. Mainly because I always think back to a session I did at the Holocaust Museum where a lot of times people think about the most, I guess, gut-wrenching image at thing at the Holocaust Museum for a lot of people is the image of all the shoes. It's not always about the gore, so to speak. I don't know how else to say it. Sometimes it's about, how it affects life. So that was something I didn't want it to be about brutality, so to speak, as far as the imagery went. And also, I also didn't allow GIFs, whatever you prefer to call them, just because it was a distraction. I thought sometimes, again, being middle schoolers, I didn't want it to be kind of jokey. These were some of the people that were researched. I actually usually allowed students to pick. I didn't want any repeats, or we would do a little bit of a drawing. But Truman, Mussolini, Stalin, Saddam Hussein, Bin Laden, Columbus, William Henry Harrison, Franco, Richard de Lionheart, Isabella, the Queen Isabella from Spain. These were all just a sample of people that were researched or have been researched over the years. Usually I did, of course, want them connected to my standards, but I was pretty loose in the connection. So if there was a current events connection, I was fine with it. For example, if there was something going on in the Middle East and the students heard something about the Crusades, Richard de Lionheart, I would give them the go ahead. Again, the Columbus and Isabella connections, of course, Columbus Day was something we were reading in junior scholastic. I will say this, I never allowed Hitler to be done. And it's not one, I usually address that pretty well, I thought, with our World War II unit. And also, I'm going to try to say this as best I can. Sometimes I think students don't have a grasp on what's going on with Hitler. He has the most skulls on the chart, if that's important. So there was a natural gravitation there. And sometimes it's just he's such a controversial figure, even to this day, in the way people throw the term out, well, he's a Hitler, she's a Hitler, things like that. I didn't want it to be that, so to speak. I wanted to dive in past Hitler. We did address Hitler, but I did that personally. There was no Hitler with any of these presentations. At the end of the presentations, we usually had 2 days of research. It was flexible. If everything was going well or we had any types of time delays, I would maybe bump it up a little bit. Teaching's about flexibility a lot of times. I wanted a 5-minute presentation. Again, I would only give them 5 minutes. I would not let them go over, just in the interest of time and learning to manage time. We would just take a couple minutes to discuss the issues. We would address some of the questions that I mentioned earlier that were the guiding questions and make connections. We would also talk about the type of government and whether the person, they thought it was correct that the person was maybe a dictator or a fascist or things of that nature. Usually took 2 to 3 days to complete. It depended if I allowed them to do pairs, groups, or individuals. A lot of times that depended on class size. And when I did the exit tickets, we would do 3 things I learned, 2 questions I have, 1 thing I would like to explore in the future, and they would actually do these at the end of the class on a little sheet, and I would go through them each night and just kind of highlight a lot of the repeat questions or major questions. And again, like I said earlier, we would talk about them the next day. At the end, we did again go back and kind of talk about a lot of the heaviness and just questions that students might have over that. And again, I mentioned this, but we would do that in a verbal or written fashion. We kind of experimented over the years with both. I also had, just to give them a plug, I sound like I am, but the materials I thought were pretty good. I usually had these charts related to governments that were up in the front of my classroom from the teacher discovery, just to kind of break down any type of confusion that students might have if they're forgetting something as far as what a term might mean. And in case you're wondering, any type of differential instruction or ESL or extensions, I would allow them to research any types of videos as long as I approved them. I tried to limit students not to use Crash Course or something like that. I had nothing against it. They just kind of defaulted to that, and I wanted them to expand. Captioning was allowed if they needed it, of course. And of course, myself, I would go in for assistance because I was moving around. I also wanted students, especially if English was a second language, to do, in the targeted language in English and make sure that they could do it. I was there to help. I did not take off points. I wanted them to get through the presentation. I would do conferences if needed and things of that ilk. I would also group by a research at our research tables. So for example, if I had someone doing Columbus and Isabella, they would work together at a table. Even just from general conversation, I figured they might be able to pick up some things from each other. And as far as extensions, if everything went well, or if we had time at the end of the year, a lot of times because the Love Then Admire chart had no one listed on it, I would do angels or hearts, and they would have to give individuals that. We did a tournament one year, and just to kind of get them to be debating and talk about skills, they did a tournament as who the most beloved person in history was, and that ended up being Amelia Earhart. The young lady who did that presentation, that was a very gifted debater, actually, even in 6th grade. And again, we always seem to find when we did current events, and use Junior Scholastic, and sometimes up front is the 2 magazines that we would do. And if we found something, we would refer back to the chart or the presentations as far as these terms and such. There's the loved and admired chart. And as you can see, it was a little different. It had nothing listed as far as no skulls or anything like measurement. And like I say, there are a few people like Peter the Great's on both and such. Some of these people were controversial too, as far as being on there. Students always ask, why is Tiger Woods on there or something like that? So just general reflections. It was always a surprise to me that the interest in this poster. Again, it was a great hook. It was a way to introduce difficult topics to students. We would also work on writing, technology, and research skills, which I think is always a big one as you're making the transition from elementary to secondary education. I will be the first to say I never went super next level with this. I've always thought about it, and of course now I'm at the university level. Haven't had the opportunity with middle schoolers at this time, but I think it would be interesting to do. But, and I don't know if it's because there was any controversy with this chart, and maybe there was, I actually was going to buy a fresh chart for this presentation to kind of, if I could hold it up or anything. I have an old beat up one. They actually this year stopped producing the chart. I don't know if it was related to controversy issues, the dates, because some people have passed on that are on the charts, but the loved and admired is still being manufactured, and the periodic chart of dictators is not. So that's kind of what I have as an overview. I didn't know how I was on time. I hope I didn't go over. If not, I can show some examples or anything like that.
Thank you so much. We're gonna head right into Dean Vesperman and Mariah Pohl's presentation, and then we'll do a joint Q&A at the end with the remaining time. And it looks like the co-host function worked for you all, so we will just jump right in with our next presenters.
Oh, Dean, I think you're muted.
There we go. Of course I'm muted. Why else wouldn't it start that way? Hi, I'm Dr. Dean Vesperman, University of Wisconsin, River Falls.
And I'm Mariah Pohl from Indiana University.
There we go. Sorry. Can everybody see the screen? All right. And this is our paper, We're Teaching Social Studies in a Time of COVID-19, an examination of contradictions in activity.
So in March 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic hit the United States, and there was an unprecedented shuttering of schools across the country. Teachers overnight had to transition from traditional face-to-face instruction to virtually teaching. And this led to a paradigm shift in the way that instruction was delivered. And this manifested itself in a variety of different ways. Some educators used remote e-learning by posting independent work for students to do on an LMS platform. Some did a mixture of teaching synchronously together through like Zoom or Google Meets with asynchronous learning, like again, independent stuff on an LMS system, or an incorporation of new educational technologies that were being developed and tried out by educators.
And so one of the things that happened during this and the origins of the study came from conversations I was having with 2 social studies teachers. And we were talking about how rapidly in the first week of how the activity of teaching social studies was going to be transformed. And that led me to think about some primary fundamental questions. And that focuses on what is the effect of this change going to have on social studies teachers or in teachers in general? And then how will the changes in teaching social studies manifest itself over the rest of that spring semester from March until May and June? And so that was one of the initial conversations. And of course, then the realization is that the activity of teaching social studies was going to change rapidly within a week or less. And that led then to the research question then that I posed to these first 2 participant researchers. And that is going to be about what effect does the rise of contradictions have on the activity of teaching social studies? And we'll get into a little bit more about what contradictions are in a second. So the theoretical framework which underpins this research in the paper is cultural historical activity theory, especially second generation activity theory, which was developed by Engstrom. And one of the reasons why I use chat for this is because in chat, the analysis is of the activity itself. It's not the subject, it's not the tools or signs teachers use or the object of what we're teaching, etc. It's on the wholeness of the activity itself. So how do we analyze a whole activity as it changes over time? And the other reason why is because of the idea that the central tenet of activity theory is that activity is a creation of over time. It has a multiplicity of views, traditions, cultures, and changes again over time. And Engstrom refers to that as multi-voicedness and historicity. And why this matters is because when doing analysis using chat, it's really important that you don't go in looking for seeing the change that every single one makes, because since the activity is created and comprises multiple voices and traditions, what's going to occur is how the activity transforms itself due to the contradictions is going to be based on the views and the traditions of the subject who is engaged. So I didn't plan or think that all the teachers would change in the same ways. So one of the key things to help you understand this study then is this table that was created. And then the key aspect of the table then was thinking about, these are the various loci, and I'll show this to you in a mediational triangle next. But what was really important was to make sure how the loci of the mediational triangle were going to be described. So who are we looking at, right? So who are the subjects? They're social studies teachers, they're participant researchers, right? What was the object? What was the purpose then they have for teaching social studies? And where the 6 participant researchers were all going to have possibly similar or different objects for why they taught social studies. And again, going down the tools and signs, right? Rules and division of labor. And it's really important, if you can take a second, just pay attention to those 2 aspects, these 2 loci, because this is going to come into play when we get to the idea of, well, what were the contradictions and where did they come from, right? And so this is how the mediational triangle is mapped out using a second generation triangle from Engstrom. And again, the definitions are the same as they were on the previous table. And this becomes very important because of methodology. So we'll talk about that in a second when I get to the methodology, about what's the importance of this mediational triangle, what's the importance of the table and its definitions, and they'll come into play in the methodology section. The other main theory, and again, this comes from Engstrom, is the idea of contradictions. And Engstrom argued in his initial work that contradictions arise in activity when there's an imbalance because of an interplay of various things, either inside or outside an activity. And that imbalance then leads to change. Another key aspect of his research is that he has argued that you can only see a contradiction. You cannot see it when it appears. You don't see it in the activity. You only see it in the actions and the words of the subject. So the contradiction appears within activity and it changes and transforms what the subject is doing. And so we'll see it in the actions and the words. Next, they argues that, look, if there's a contradiction, it isn't resolved by a simple way of just combining competing forces or balancing priorities, right? And the reason why is because he's argued that contradiction leads to creative innovations in activity, and that leads to qualitative transformations of the activity. And so because of that, when looking at the research and then Engstrom's contradictions, and I'm not going to argue that there wasn't a primary or tertiary or quaternary contradiction that appeared in the study, but it's very obvious then that the primary contradiction that appeared was a secondary contradiction. And the reason why is because you have a new element, COVID. It's outside the activity of teaching social studies, and it radically changes the division of labor and the rules for how we teach social studies. And so that's why when this initial research after the first rounds of discussions and interviews, et cetera, I really focused then on, okay, we're looking at a secondary contradiction here, given the way that the participant researchers were describing what was occurring in their classroom. So methodology, I'm gonna go through a few things rather quickly. It was convenient sample. All 6 teachers were known to me. If you want descriptions of those, they're in the paper. There were 2 middle school, 2 high school. 1 was a homeschool teacher and 1 taught in a 6 through 12 school. One of the key things right from the beginning is I wanted to do something more than member checking. And so I turned to Bergold and Thomas's principles of participant researchers. And so they've laid out 4 principles you should follow when doing participant researchers. And those principles were followed throughout the study. There were 3 semi-structured interviews, one during the first week of the rapid shift from face-to-face to online learning, one during then the second interview during the 4th and 5th week, and then at the end of the semester. Initially, after each interview, I used selective coding using the loci described by Engstrom to lay out and code the interview into a mediational triangle. And those triangles then were shared with the participant researchers for them to either add to, make changes, modify, etc. And then after the post-interview, after the 3rd interviews, there was a second round of selective coding that Mariah and I did, and looking for the overall patterns and the changes. And that's the table that we have here. And so the table here shows these are what manifested after that second round of selective coding that occurred, which looked at all 6 participant researchers. And so take a second here. What stands out? What do you see as unique?
Well, I was kind of surprised that in the chart it says personal connection to current events. Only 3 of the 6 teachers did that, but I don't know what that means. That makes me curious. That's what stands out.
Mm-hmm. Others? And to answer your question, Catherine, is one of the things that would make me curious too, but then given the historicity and the multi-voicedness of activity, I wasn't surprised that we might see some, unique things pop up, right? And so, Mariah?
So one of the new objects that came about that we noticed was that teachers thought one of the reasons they should teach social studies is promoting media literacy. And we have 2 quotes here from teacher 1 and teacher 4 in our study. And I first want us to look at teacher 1's quote from their second interview. So if we could read through their quote, and if I can have someone share, what did teacher 1 want from their students in their classroom? Would anybody like to share what teacher 1 wanted from their students in their classroom from the first quote there?
I think they definitely are wanting students to think critically, but specifically as they're thinking about media, which I'm sure that they were looking at and listening to a lot more in this moment of a global pandemic, something that was affecting everybody.
Exactly, thank you so much. And then let's do the same thing for teacher number 4. What did teacher number 4 want from their students in their classroom with media literacy?
Well, I think they want to find a way to deal with this flood of information that comes at them and figure out, what do I do with all this stuff? What do I keep? What do I get rid of? Yeah, I'd vote for that one myself.
Exactly, having students not be so confused with the flood of information, like you said, and how to interpret that and connect it to their own lives. And then there were some new activities with culturally mediating artifacts that these teachers created in their classroom, like an online news disinformation game. And so let's look at what teacher 1 said on how this artifact was used in their classroom. So I'll give you a moment to read what teacher one said, and if I could have again someone share.
Basically asking them to create their own clickbait so that they have to kind of apply what they know about disinformation, what they've learned about disinformation, in order to create something that would be clickbaity.
Yes, so having the students be put like in another shoes of clickbait and see how it works, so they could see how it affects them. And then teacher number 4 did scientific reading of the news, and let's look at their quote and how they did that in their classroom. So if we could read through it and then have someone share what teacher 4 did.
This is also education, only they're applying what they've learned about reading scientifically. So they've done it together, and then now they're going to pick an article from a news source and apply what they have found from the TED Talk to that new article by answering questions.
Thank you so much. Yeah, with the TED Talks, having use the skill that a TED Talk the teacher chose, and then having it use those same skills in an article the students picked on their own for adding interest. Thank you. Some other things that of activities that teachers did was viewing current events through multiple lenses, and teacher 1 and teacher 4 both did this. So let's look at their 2 quotes side by side, and then if you guys can share what teachers 1 and 4 did.
They definitely wanted students to look at multiple perspectives within news media and be able to compare and contrast them, and then kind of ask them critical literacy questions about who the source was, what the purpose was, maybe who wasn't asked to participate in the discussion.
Yeah, so more scientific reading of the news here as well, with the current events through multiple lenses. Another new object that came about for why these educators thought their mission was to teach social studies was to have students personally connect to the current events that were happening in the spring of 2020. Teachers 2, 3, and 6 elaborated on this in their interviews. So let's look at all their 3 quotes, and if I can have someone share what they wanted their students to learn from social studies at this time.
It seems that the students want, or that the teachers want the students to see themselves in history, that they're part of it. And it's not just distant, dead white men from long ago, but that history is happening right now.
Yes, and that they're a part of the making of history too, with all of the events happening in the spring of 2020.
Having the see themselves as a primary source, I think, is also kind of that personal, making that personal connection, but that they themselves are primary sources based on what they're living through and the things they've encountered.
Yes. And then with that new object, the new culturally mediating artifacts that came from this, teacher 2, they had students free write in an online document about current events in the past. Teacher 3 had students develop a coronavirus blog. Teacher 6 had students do problem-based learning projects. So let's look at teacher 2, 3, and 6's quotes about these projects that they did. And after we look through them, if we could share what they did or how they did these things.
Yeah, it looks like the teachers are having the students create and generate content really from their point of view and perspectives. I'm thinking about these blogs from the one in the middle, that's, you know, something that could be used as a primary source later in their lives, you know, and that would get at something a little bit different with maybe how they would have remembered something as opposed to how they processed it in the moment. But yeah, they're the creators and generators of material with these 3 activities.
Yeah, so with the coronavirus blogs, seeing themselves as a part of history, as we were saying earlier, and with Teacher 6, the creation of the campaigns, connecting events from the past to how they're affecting the present with civil rights, Reconstruction, connecting that to Black Lives Matter, and other events of spring 2020.
So one of the things then we saw was, we know that COVID-19 changed the rules and division of labor for teaching social studies. We know that it changed it in dramatic ways. And we know then from Engstrom's theory of contradictions, that gave rise to a secondary contradiction. And we saw how that contradiction then manifests itself in the actions and words of the participant researchers. And that led to then some qualitative transformations in the activity. One of the key things is that there were degrees of transformation. Some of the participants, especially participant 5, had some major qualitative transformations in the way that they changed their class, but the transformations they went through weren't very unique compared to the other 5 participant researchers. And that's why, you know, teacher 5 isn't featured in this research. We see that there were creative innovations to the activity. And again, this research focuses only on 2 of the changes that we saw that we thought were very significant. And why they were significant was because the innovations in the classroom led to the rise of new objects for teaching social studies. And then that led to the creation of new culturally mediated artifacts or modifications to culturally mediated artifacts of the classroom to meet the needs of this new object, these new objects that appeared, again, because of the secondary contradiction caused by COVID. And are there questions?
Thank you. So we can open it up for Q&A for either of the presentations.
Well, Dean, I thought your using of these theoretical perspectives and then coming back to them in the end made this much more powerful.
Well,
then I think so many people are just seeing that we had all these shocks of the year and things are different, but to make it more meaningful. And I found that very insightful. Thank you, Dean.
Well,
both of you also, Mariah also. But Dean did the theory part, so.
Yeah, Dean enlightened me to all the theory part too when he asked me to be a part of this study.
You mean when I kept emailing you new articles to read?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, that was one of the things about, you know, my research is always focusing on cultural historical activity theory, and thinking about when I was seeing the changes in the conversation I was having with 2 of the participant researchers in those early days. It just led to the idea of okay, so how do you explain what could happen before it happens, right? How do you think about it theoretically before it happens, and then allowing the teachers to, you know, reflect on their own work, see their work, as participant researchers, and then to look at what were the manifestations, right? So what did this do and change, right? So how do we see this, right? So, and so that's what led to, yeah, the theoretical lens.
One of the things I found interesting, the media literacy piece, as someone who just taught through the pandemic myself with 10th graders and 12th graders, I found myself doing more media literacy this year than I probably normally would have, particularly with my 10th graders. Charles put in the chat talking about the SHEG resources, and that's what I use. I actually found those very nice for getting a feel for how much they knew about media literacy and being able to kind of rank the kids and where they are and what was going on as kind of a pre-thing. But I thought that was interesting that I wasn't the only one that was worried about media literacy as we're going into this constant online environment.
And the interesting thing is that some of the other participants, referenced media a little, but what they had said was not significant enough to see that, that like these two, right, the two, teachers 1 and 4, what the other 4 had said wasn't significant enough to actually be able to say that they had changed your activity of, teaching social studies. Where in 1 and 4, it was very obvious by the second interview, media literacy had become an essential part of almost, the activities they were doing every week, the activities they were doing with the students, right? So, and that's one of the reasons why, but then again, that goes back to the idea that, an activity, given the fact that its historicity and the multi-voicedness of it, you aren't going to see the same qualitative transformations from all, from the teachers, all the teachers across the board. Besides the obvious ones of the shifts to synchronous and asynchronous learning, more use of media. I mean, I think 4 of the 6 teachers talked about crash course videos and using that as part of asynchronous learning. I mean, that's interesting, but that, that wasn't really, significant.
Crash course was being used pre-pandemic as well, so.
Right.
Did any of the
sorry,
teachers,
Catherine.
No, I was just thinking about how, correct me if I'm wrong, but this study particularly focuses, am I remembering in the March through May or June, not in this last school year, but in that emergency remote teaching time?
Just that time period, yep.
So I'm reflecting back on the teacher in my house who I live with, who went emergency remote during that time, and what the activity of teaching looked like from my front row seat. And a lot of the concern for them were that students didn't have access to the internet, students weren't showing up. And so the activity of teaching, a considerable amount for my husband's district and for his job in particular, was hoping kids would show up, and teachers volunteering to give out meals on, on the curb outside the school and things like that. So I'm kind of wondering what you found as far as the activity of teaching, including content type things and skills that are social studies skills versus the activity of teaching of reaching your students.
Right. And the interesting thing is if we could share all the data with you, you would see a lot of it. There's a lot of rich data there for that. But several of the participant researchers were very concerned about not sharing information about their school, not sharing information about their students, not sharing information about even like the politics of the decisions that were occurring. And so, as as one of the principles of participant researchers is that participant researchers get to decide the levels amount of how much they're going to share, and they help decide what the focus of the study would be. And so I have a ton of rich data. I mean, trust me, there's so much in there about, like going back to like Nell Nodding's concepts of care, right? And talking about care during a time of crisis, a teacher of care, right? I could probably we'd probably get a whole paper out of that, but the participants, researchers, like I said, about 4 of the 6 of them were really concerned that we don't focus on students, schools, politics, those types of things, even though we talked about it as part of, the interview process, but that was just data that wasn't, we didn't, they didn't want to share. And so I made the decision then that we weren't going to include it.
I think too, with teachers knowing that it's going to be hard to reach their students when transitioned completely to virtual instruction, I think that's why a lot of the teachers too focused on media literacy and personal connection, because it'd be like the hook for when the students finally did come online, to feel the desire to want to participate in the social studies curriculum.
That's the question. Just out of curiosity, and mine is a very small sample size, but and you may have mentioned this, but were the teachers who took part, would they classify themselves as tech savvy? The only reason I ask that is because I noticed with our student teachers in the spring, in that period you were talking about between that March to June, they had a lot of different experiences with their cooperating teachers, because it seemed like, and I'm very much stereotyping here a little bit, teachers who were very much tenured and had gotten comfortable to a certain way seemed to not make the switch as easily as some of the younger teachers actually who were used to using the tech. And I don't know if you had any, like, were privy to that, but was there any like tech savviness to the participants, or did they acknowledge that or anything?
There was only one participant researcher where the growth in being tech savvy was an issue for them. The other 5 were pretty adaptable and were able to technologically make the shift and changes. Where there was one where the shift in using more technology was something antithetical to what they believed the teaching should be, and that became a bit of a barrier. But that didn't manifest itself like in a new, there wasn't really, a new object or other changes that occurred. And of course, where we'd see that change would either be in the division of labor or the rules of teaching social studies. And that was being transformed by COVID anyway. So that's why, as you saw the chart, we didn't even cover changes to the division of labor or rules, because that, that's what the secondary contradiction completely, manifests itself is in the transformation of those 2 parts of the mediational triangle. Carol?
Okay, I have 2 thoughts. One is, since you mentioned that this was just your participants are 6 individuals who you were already connected to. Mm-hmm. I hope that you're able to also follow them up at the end of this year, and then a year from now, after they've been back in person. I think that would tell us, a great deal about, I guess, activity change under crises or something. And I'm also struck by when you're saying a foundational principle of participant researchers is they get to say what it is they look at, what they're going to include, what they're not going to include. Mm-hmm. That I think we also need to acknowledge a limitation is that there's more of a tendency to want to give socially acceptable responses, which was something we always had to say when we did interviews. And, as the researcher, how did we know that the interviewee was not wanting to do that?
Mm-hmm. That's one of the key questions then was what, and that's one of the reasons why in the interviews themselves, to keep them in that semi-structured format, was a space for the teachers to share other concerns beyond what they had, what we had discussed, just with the knowledge that, that was a space where they could share and talk about particular issues, but that data was not going to appear itself because, I mean, I'll be honest, 2 of the teachers teach in districts where if information came out, what they shared with us about what was going on in the school, about decisions made, etc., you know, they wouldn't feel, you know, their position as a teacher wouldn't feel very safe. And so for my position, it was better to protect the identities of the participant researchers and to stick to their wishes.
Right.
Even though, like I said to Catherine's question, we've got a lot of rich data, you know, but it's just not going to be touched.
There may also be a way to kind of cue future readers to that in a limitation section or in a methodology section to say, this is a pretty narrow focus on specific social studies teaching activities, but teaching activities changed in myriad ways beyond that, you know, because I do know that resonates with me, having teachers be very close-lipped about what their opinions are of how their administrations were responding in the moment. But there's something there as well.
And
Right.
we keep
And
acknowledging that we're living in a period of extreme polar.
I think Carol froze for a minute.
Mhm.
And to answer the question for both Carol and you, Catherine, is there is a section in the methodology when I go through the principles of participant researchers where that's addressed.
Good. Yeah. Yeah.
It's kind of a shame, but I'm teaching a political science class, and in their discussions, they admit to self-censoring because they feel very unsafe. And given that we're now in a state that passed a ban on teaching current events and teaching critical race theory or race and racism,
No,
they're
teaching
more
is
scared.
fine. Socialist teaching is fine, but for God's sakes, don't let people use it.
They don't
that
want them
was-
to learn it.
That was one of the really interesting things I thought about Jason's presentation, was how it seemed so clear to me that you really worked with your students to make sure they understood the differences between these big terms that have just been conflated in our media online. And
You know,
yeah.
I will say, I didn't say it during my presentation, and I maybe not articulately anyway. I do sometimes worry, like with 6th graders, I guess what I was trying to get across, I think these are pretty heavy topics, even like with COVID, and I think they're tough for adults. And I think if you look at the standards and such, I mean, this isn't groundbreaking stuff, but we expect these middle schoolers to have almost like hit the ground running on these very complicated themes. And I'll admit, I was in a very small school when I did a lot of that. And I think I had the luxury of my classes were small and I could do a lot of conferencing and all. I don't know how that would have worked if I would have been even if I could have done anything like that in a COVID type setting. It would have been tough, but it's, so I was just thinking, even with student teaching, seeing with the following presentation, there were so many different ways I was seeing different states, different schools, different teachers, how they were approaching everything. It was eye-opening, and you could tell some were taking to it like a fish to water, and then others, they were working hard, but they felt like they were treading, and it's tough. So.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate on why Truman was on there? I'm thinking McCullough might not be happy with that character.
Well, you know what? It's just funny. I kind of glossed over that. Truman started the whole thing. He was on there, I always assumed, for the atomic bomb. And that was the decision. And some of it, I always viewed the chart as just to get a conversation started. And what happened was, I think he had 3 skulls. And of course, then it got into, I originally was doing it where the students would just debate whether that was the correct amount, should he even be on there. Most of them always thought he should be on there, but maybe 1 skull or anything like that. I don't know if it was just that chart, I think, is from 2008 or 2009. So, I mean, it was, I think, a little bit ahead of the game, and I think it was just a conversation starter. There's some interesting people in there. I didn't get into it with the 7th graders. I used it a little bit for more modern connections. There is a lot on a lot of African leaders and modern times that are on there. I just thought, again, getting into the complexity, that was some pretty serious stuff. And sometimes it was almost too real and too modern. That was one of those fine lines with current events you were getting into. But to answer your original question, I think Truman was just on there to maybe sell posters and just get the conversation started. But that would be my guess.
But it's not like he even knew about the plan until FDR died. So if you're going to blame somebody, I'd be blaming the man that was 4 times the president.
It's funny, I'm pointing at it like you can see it on my thing. I had a couple student examples and I can send them. Originally, when we did the comparison, that you would get an A on the project, because that was the student's point a lot of times, was this, why Truman didn't know, and what he knew, maybe he made the right decision. And some of them even would get into, is it fair to hold Truman accountable to what we hold as our standards now when we weren't going through it? And, that can be debated too, but they would reach a little bit of next level stuff. And Truman, I think, really was the root of it, just for like the reasons that you're talking about, is why is he even on there? Now, William Henry Harrison was on there, but I didn't think he had the appeal, obviously, like Truman did. But again, they would ask. The Columbus one was usually the hot button one, honestly, because it seemed like the students were really into that topic because of a lot of the things that were going on with the holiday, and some states changing it to Indigenous days and things like that. But yeah, Truman, I agree. And actually, some students did make the point that maybe if Truman's on there, why isn't FDR, or, things like that.
Well, it also raises the issue of, to what extent is it fair to apply contemporary ethical and moral standards to someone a century ago or 2 centuries ago, or in medieval times.
Well, and I guess the times are changing, but someone who got mentioned my last year that I did it, Woodrow Wilson started to come up a little more, where students would bring up. When I started it, it didn't seem like Woodrow Wilson was mentioned as much, or at all, really. And then I noticed, because I have seen in the news lately, he's mentioned more as someone who, maybe wasn't for women's rights to vote and things like that, and just some of his, quite honestly, racist background. So it was coming on. And again, I don't know, it was interesting. I just like that my 6th graders would talk about this stuff, and and that was kind of the main goal of it. But yeah, A for you.
I would have liked to have seen more women on that chart.
You know what? I will say there's only a couple in there, and that's Isabella was obviously, she was one that a lot of did, and I think Catherine the Great was on there. I will be the first to say some I would kind of censor a little bit, because I didn't know where it could lead the students far. Like Romans, I would, like when we did 7th grade, I usually steered clear of Romans, only because of the research. I didn't know what they would get into a little bit with like someone like Caligula. I'm trying to PG this a little bit. But yeah, I agree with the women. And actually, there was an actual curiosity, and that question was asked a lot. Like, what should there be some women leaders on here? There's a lot on the loved and admired. I hate to say it though, if you would see my homeroom in the morning, students gravitate to the bad guys, for better or for worse. That's what, I don't know why, but they would never like go into that. But when we did the loved and admired, I mentioned we did a tournament. The Final 4 were women. Like the students were all into that. So.
You see, women made it to the Final 4, so
they did.
That's great.
See that now? The interesting.
Did the women get the same equivalent as the men in terms of the resources? There was a little bit of controversy with the Final 4 this year.
Oh, you're talking. I know.
I'm talking about the NCAA giving women the crap.
Putting us in the bad stadiums, putting us in the bad,
the food. Did you see the food they gave the women? It was disgusting.
And it was
I was thinking about Margaret Thatcher or Indira Gandhi, not
or Benazir Bhutto.
Basketball players.
Wait, they played in the Final 4? All right,
she can dribble. Yeah.
But see, Jason, one of the interesting things would be now that they don't make that poster anymore. Think about a classroom project where students would create their own periodic table.
That's what I think it is. We actually did something. We fiddled around with that a little bit at the end, and I think it is. I'm all for things that just get students interested. I just want them into it, and I can work with the details after that. And I don't know, I actually emailed them just for this presentation. I was like, why are you not producing this anymore? And I thought maybe they weren't comfortable with it, but they just said, we're just not making it anymore. And I was kind of surprised, because I've even had student teachers contact me because they thought it would be a good hook for their students. But I agree. I think making your own would be a good way to do that.
It begs the question, are they not producing because it's not selling, or because they don't want to take the risk of anyone buying it? You know?
Well, that's what I was kind of wondering, if I kind of was wondering if it had dated itself a little bit. I don't know, but it's interesting. But there was interesting things, even like Henry VIII, where again, our 7th grade standards, he had like 4 skulls, but then for his wife, they had a little blurb for his wives, he had 10. And it's kind of silly and funny, but the students would start to ask questions, and then we could kind of get into it. And, you know, you could get into like Anne Boleyn and things
We
like
need to
that.
see a more modern adaptation of that.
I agree.
I think the idea is compelling.
I think it could really lead to, after that kind of project, to bringing in conversations about heroification and villainification, and really thinking about how are we all part of these charts too.
Well, that was the Yasser Arafat aspect, and we would actually do a little bit of that with current events, where they would get into and totally perspectives. Well, Dean talked about like lenses and things like that. That, you know, you could get into the whole points of view, historical points of view, and things like that. So I totally agree.
I'm just going to honor our time. We went over by a few minutes, but I was really appreciating this conversation. There is a small break in the program now, and I did put the link in the chat. There's a 2:55 Eastern start time for the next one, if anybody is wanting to have easy access to that. Thank you to our presenters. This was a lovely hour to think about these different social studies ideas. So I really appreciate you giving us your expertise today.
And there is a lesson posted.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Yes, it's on our Google Drive.
Great. Wonderful. Well,
Thank you
thanks.
all.
We'll see
Thank
you all
you,
later.
guys.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.